David Marshall thought he knew what survival meant after 30 years of hiking the world's most challenging trails. He had weathered blizzards in the Rockies, navigated dense jungles in South America, and crossed scorching deserts that tested every ounce of his endurance. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened when a violent storm tore apart his small expedition boat, leaving him stranded on an island that didn't exist on any map. With no food, no shelter, and no way to signal for help, this seasoned outdoorsman faced the ultimate test of human resilience. Armed with nothing but his wits and decades of wilderness experience, David had to learn that survival wasn't just about staying alive. But what he discovered hidden in the island's dense interior would change everything he thought he knew about this place. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first sensation that penetrated David's consciousness wasn't pain, though his body certainly carried plenty of that. It was the rhythmic whisper of waves against stone, a sound both soothing and alien after the chaos that had brought him here. His eyelids felt heavy, crusted with salt and sand. But he forced them open to witness his first dawn on this nameless piece of earth. The sky above painted itself in soft pastels, rose and amber bleeding into the deep blue of retreating night. David lay on his back among a collection of smooth stones, each one polished by countless tides. His waterlogged hiking boots, those faithful companions that had carried him across 3 continents and through adventures he'd never imagined possible, now squelched with every slight movement. They were filled with a mixture of seawater and gritty sand, transforming his most trusted gear into waterlogged anchors that seemed to mock his predicament. He sat up slowly, his spine protesting with sharp reminders of the previous night's ordeal. The storm had been unlike anything he'd encountered in 30 years of wilderness travel. One moment, he'd been reviewing his charts in the small expedition boat's cabin, planning his route through the lesser-known islands of the South Pacific. The next, he was fighting for his life as waves the size of buildings tossed his vessel like a child's toy. Now, in the gentle light of morning, he could see the evidence of that battle scattered around him. Pieces of his boat's hull lay wedged between the rocks, splintered and twisted beyond recognition. A life preserver, its bright orange color faded and torn, had washed up several yards away. But it was his boots that drew his attention back, those leather monuments to every mountain peak he'd conquered, every trail he'd mastered. They represented thousands of miles of confident steps, and now they couldn't even keep his feet dry. David pulled himself to his feet, water streaming from his boots with each step. The immediate shoreline stretched perhaps 200 yards in either direction before disappearing around rocky promontories. Behind him, dense tropical vegetation climbed toward what appeared to be a volcanic ridge running down the island's spine. The air carried scents both familiar and foreign, salt spray mixed with the green richness of jungle growth and something else, something that reminded him of the deep forests of his youth. His mental inventory was brief and sobering. The clothes on his back, thoroughly soaked and beginning to stiffen with salt. His waterlogged boots, a pocket knife clipped to his belt that had somehow survived the wreck. Nothing else. No pack, no emergency supplies, no communication equipment. Even his watch had stopped, its face cracked and filled with seawater. The sun climbed higher, and David felt its warmth beginning to chase away the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He needed to move, to explore, to understand what resources this place might offer. But first, he allowed himself a moment to simply breathe and acknowledge the magnitude of his situation. In all his years of wilderness experience, he had never faced anything approaching this level of isolation and deprivation. He remembered reading accounts of other castaways, stories that had always seemed romantic in their telling. Robinson Crusoe, Swiss Family Robinson, tales of adventure and ingenuity triumphing over adversity. The reality felt far less romantic. His stomach already gnawed with the first hints of hunger. His throat felt scratchy with thirst, and every muscle in his body ached from the battering he'd taken, but David Marshall hadn't spent 3 decades in the world's most challenging environments without learning something about human resilience. He'd seen what the human spirit could accomplish when stripped of modern conveniences and forced to rely on fundamental skills. He'd witnessed his own capacity for adaptation in situations that had initially seemed impossible. He began walking along the shoreline, his boots creating deep impressions in the coarse sand and leaving small pools of seawater in his wake. The immediate priority was water, fresh water. A person could survive weeks without food if necessary, but only days without drinking water. In this tropical climate, with the sun promising to grow increasingly intense, dehydration would become a serious threat very quickly. The coastline curved gently to his right, revealing a small inlet where the waves had carved a protected cove. Here the sand was finer, almost white, and coconut palms leaned out over the water at impossible angles. David's spirits lifted slightly. Coconut palms meant coconut water, a reliable source of both hydration and basic nutrition. He might not starve or die of thirst on his first day after all. As he stood at the edge of the cove, watching the sun climb higher into a cloudless sky, David felt something shift inside him. The panic and disorientation of the night were giving way to a familiar feeling, one he'd experienced on countless wilderness expeditions when the civilized world fell away and only fundamental human skills remained. He was no longer David Marshall, the planning engineer from Seattle. He was becoming something more elemental, a man whose survival depended entirely on his ability to read the natural world and respond to its demands. David's first comprehensive exploration of his new world began with a methodical survey of the cove. The protected inlet offered more than just aesthetic beauty. It represented his best hope for establishing a base camp. The coconut palms provided both shade and sustenance, while the calm water suggested this might be a natural harbor where debris from his wrecked boat might continue to wash ashore. He reached into his pocket for his compass, a reliable instrument that had guided him through fog-shrouded mountain passes and trackless desert expanses. His fingers closed around the familiar weight of the device, but when he withdrew it, his heart sank. The compass face was cracked diagonally, a spider web of fractures spreading from a central impact point. Seawater had leaked inside, and the needle spun aimlessly, pointing in all directions and none. This small device had been his connection to the cardinal directions, his anchor to the known world. Now it was just another piece of broken equipment, as lost and disoriented as he was. Setting the useless compass aside, David turned his attention to more immediate concerns. The sun was climbing toward its zenith, and the tropical heat was beginning to build. His salt-crusted clothes clung uncomfortably to his skin, and he could feel the first warning signs of dehydration beginning to manifest. A slight headache and increasing thirst that ocean water could never satisfy. The coconut palms beckoned invitingly, but reaching their fruit proved more challenging than anticipated. The trunks rose 30 feet or more, their surfaces worn smooth by wind and weather. David had climbed trees as a boy, but that was decades ago, and these specimens offered few handholds for a man of 57 years. After several unsuccessful attempts that left him winded and scraped, he accepted that he would need to find fallen coconuts or devise some other method for harvesting the precious water they contained. His search along the high tide line proved more fruitful. Several green coconuts lay scattered among the rocks and debris, apparently knocked down by the same storm that had brought him here. David selected the heaviest one and examined it carefully. Getting into a coconut without proper tools required technique and patience, skills he'd learned during a survival course in Costa Rica many years earlier. Using a sharp-edged rock, he began working at the fibrous husk, slowly exposing the hard inner shell. The work was tedious and tough on his hands, but eventually he managed to create a small opening. The first taste of coconut water was like salvation itself, sweet, slightly salty, and refreshingly cool. He drank deeply, feeling his body respond gratefully to the hydration. With his immediate thirst addressed, David began a more systematic exploration of his surroundings. The cove was roughly horseshoe-shaped, perhaps 50 yards across at its widest point. A small freshwater stream trickled down from the jungle interior, cutting a channel through the sand before disappearing into the sea. This discovery was even more significant than the coconuts. Fresh water meant he could survive here indefinitely, at least from a hydration standpoint. He followed the stream inland for several hundred yards, pushing through increasingly dense vegetation. The jungle was alive with sounds, bird calls he couldn't identify, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, and the constant drip and whisper of moisture moving through the canopy above. The stream led him to a series of small pools carved into volcanic rock, each one fed by the next higher level in a natural staircase of clear, cold water. David knelt beside the lowest pool and cupped his hands, bringing the water to his lips. It tasted clean and fresh, with just a hint of the mineral character that spoke of its journey through volcanic stone. He drank deeply, then splashed the cool water on his face and neck, washing away layers of salt and sand. The vegetation around the pools was thick and varied. David recognized some plants from his travels. Breadfruit trees with their distinctive large leaves, banana plants showing the first signs of developing fruit, and various ferns and flowering vines. Other species were unfamiliar, and he made mental notes to investigate them more carefully once he had established basic shelter and security. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, David realized he had been exploring for hours without a clear sense of the island's size or shape. From his vantage point near the pools, he could see that the land rose substantially toward the interior, suggesting this was no mere sandbar, but a substantial piece of real estate. Somewhere up there, beyond the canopy, might be high ground that could serve as a lookout point or signal location, but those explorations would have to wait. The tropical sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and David had learned enough about wilderness survival to know that preparation for nightfall began well before darkness actually arrived. He needed shelter, and he needed it soon. The thought of spending a night exposed to the elements, particularly if weather moved in, was not appealing. He made his way back toward the cove, his broken compass weighing heavy in his pocket like a reminder of just how far he was from any known reference point. The harsh reality of island survival revealed itself with unforgiving clarity over the following days. David's confidence, built over decades of wilderness experience, crumbled piece by piece as he confronted challenges that his previous adventures had never prepared him to face. The island seemed determined to teach him humility, and it was a demanding instructor. His first lesson came through hunger. The coconut water and meat had sustained him initially, but his body craved protein and more substantial nourishment. David fashioned what he believed would be an effective fishing spear from a straight piece of driftwood, carefully sharpening one end with his pocket knife and hardening the point over a small fire. The result looked impressive enough, nearly 6 feet of polished wood tapering to a needle-sharp tip. His confidence lasted exactly as long as it took to thrust the spear at his first fish. The weapon struck the water with considerable force, but instead of piercing its target, the hastily carved point struck a submerged rock and shattered completely. The fish, a colorful specimen that had been tantalizingly close, darted away with what David could have sworn was an air of reproach. He stood waist-deep in the lagoon, holding the stub of his broken spear, feeling like a fool. The failed fishing spear became a symbol of his overconfidence and the island's stern lessons. Every assumption he'd made about survival skills had to be reconsidered. This wasn't the controlled environment of a weekend camping trip, or even the challenging but familiar terrain of mountain wilderness. This was an alien ecosystem with its own rules, and David was very much an outsider trying to learn its language. His attempts at hunting proved equally humbling. The island supported various bird species, and David had convinced himself that catching one couldn't be too difficult. He spent an entire morning constructing snares from twisted plant fibers, positioning them along what appeared to be well-used bird paths through the underbrush. By evening, he had caught nothing but his own foot in one of the contraptions, resulting in a painful fall and a twisted ankle that would ache for days. The weather proved to be another unforgiving teacher. David had experienced tropical storms before, but never while completely exposed and vulnerable. On his fourth day, clouds gathered with ominous speed, and the barometric pressure seemed to drop like a stone. The rain, when it came, wasn't the gentle tropical shower he'd expected, but a driving deluge that turned his carefully constructed lean-to shelter into a sodden mess within minutes. He huddled under a rocky overhang, watching 3 days' worth of fire-making materials turn into waterlogged pulp. His clothes, which had finally begun to dry and lose their salt-crust stiffness, became saturated once again. Worse, the stream he'd been relying on for fresh water turned muddy and turbulent, forcing him to wait hours after the storm passed before he dared drink from it again. But perhaps the most profound lesson came through silence. David had always considered himself comfortable with solitude. His hiking expeditions often involved days of minimal human contact. But this was different. This was absolute isolation, with no predetermined endpoint and no guarantee of rescue. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, filled with the weight of uncertainty and the growing realization that he might be here far longer than he'd initially imagined. The island's rhythm became his rhythm, though not by choice. He woke with the sunrise because he had no artificial light for nighttime activities. He'd learned to read the subtle changes in wind direction that warned of incoming weather. His body began to adjust to a diet heavy in coconut and the few edible plants he'd managed to identify with confidence. Small victories punctuated the catalogue of failures and lessons. He successfully started a fire using dry coconut fiber as tinder and his knife as a flint striker against volcanic rock. The flame that resulted was perhaps the most beautiful sight he'd ever witnessed, a small orange beacon of human ingenuity in the vast indifference of nature. He protected that fire jealously, maintaining it through careful attention to fuel and shelter. His shelter, too, gradually improved through trial and error. The lean-to that had failed so miserably in the storm was replaced by a more substantial structure built into a natural depression between 2 large rocks. He wove palm fronds into waterproof panels and learned to select building materials that would resist the island's humidity and sudden weather changes. The broken fishing spear, which he kept propped against a tree near his camp, served as a daily reminder of the gap between knowledge and skill, between confidence and competence. Every time he looked at it, he was reminded that survival wasn't about what he thought he knew. It was about what he could actually accomplish with his hands, his wit, and whatever materials the island chose to provide. As the sun set on his 7th day, David sat beside his carefully maintained fire, turning the spear fragment over in his hands. He was thinner now, his clothes hanging looser on his frame, but he felt strangely more solid, more present in his own skin. The island was teaching him, stroke by painful stroke, how to truly inhabit the world rather than simply move through it. By the 2nd week, David had begun to understand that survival was less about dramatic gestures and more about small, consistent improvements. Each day brought subtle refinements to his techniques, modest additions to his knowledge, and gradual adaptation to the island's demands. The painful lessons of his first week had evolved into something more productive, a genuine education in the art of staying alive. His breakthrough came through an unlikely teacher, the island's abundant supply of coconut husks and fiber. After watching his carefully split kindling turn to soggy pulp during yet another tropical downpour, David experimented with the fibrous material that surrounded the coconut's hard shells. He discovered that the coarse, hair-like fibers could be separated and twisted into surprisingly strong cordage. His first attempts produced lumpy, uneven rope that fell apart under tension, but persistence yielded steady, Improvement, the hand-woven grass rope that emerged from hours of patient work, represented more than just a useful tool. It was proof that he could create something functional from the island's raw materials. The rope was roughly 30 feet long, inconsistent in thickness but surprisingly durable. He tested it by securing one end to a sturdy palm tree and hanging his full weight from the other end. It held without breaking, and for the first time since his arrival, David felt a genuine surge of accomplishment. With reliable cordage available, his shelter construction improved dramatically. The simple lean-to that had barely protected him from light rain evolved into a more sophisticated structure. He lashed together a frame of strong branches, creating a framework that could support properly woven palm frond panels. The new shelter featured a slanted roof that shed water effectively and walls that could be adjusted based on wind direction and weather conditions. Fire-making, too, became less of a daily struggle and more of a routine skill. David had learned to identify the driest materials the island offered and to maintain a constant supply of tinder in a waterproof container fashioned from a large piece of curved bark. His firebow technique, initially clumsy and ineffective, gradually became more reliable through repetition and careful attention to the subtle variables that determined success or failure. The island revealed its edible secrets slowly, requiring careful observation and cautious experimentation. David had identified several species of plants that appeared safe to eat, but he tested each one methodically, starting with tiny amounts and monitoring his body's response over several hours before consuming larger quantities. Breadfruit, when properly prepared, provided substantial nutrition. Wild taro roots, once cooked thoroughly to neutralize their natural irritants, offered valuable carbohydrates. Various greens and shoots added vitamins and variety to his gradually expanding diet. His fishing efforts evolved from the disastrous spear incident into more sophisticated approaches. Using his newly crafted rope, David constructed fish traps from woven palm fronds and positioned them in the shallow areas where small fish congregated during high tide. The first trap yielded nothing but seaweed, but adjustments to design and placement gradually improved his success rate. Within a few days, he was regularly catching enough small fish to supplement his plant-based diet with valuable protein. Water collection and storage became another area of steady improvement. Beyond the reliable stream, David learned to position large leaves and improvised containers to catch rainwater during the frequent tropical showers. He carved a series of storage vessels from coconut shells and gourds, creating a backup water supply that could sustain him if the stream became temporarily undrinkable after heavy rains. The island's daily rhythm became deeply familiar. Dawn brought the cacophony of awakening birds and the gradual warming of air that had cooled overnight. Morning was the time for water collection, fire maintenance, and the day's food gathering. Midday heat drove him to seek shade and focus on craft work, improving tools, expanding his shelter, or working on long-term projects. Afternoon brought foraging expeditions and trap checking. Evening was for cooking, equipment maintenance, and the careful banking of his fire to ensure coals would survive until morning. David's body adapted to this new life with surprising speed. The soft hands of an office worker gave way to calloused palms that could handle rough cordage and sharp stones without injury. His appetite, initially confused by the absence of familiar foods, settled into a pattern that matched the island's offerings. He lost weight, but gained a different kind of strength. The lean muscle that came from constant physical activity and the mental resilience that developed through daily problem-solving. The grass rope that hung coiled near his fire became a symbol of transformation. Every evening, as he performed the ritual of banking his coals and preparing for another night in his island home, David would touch the rope and remember the feeling of creating something useful from nothing. It reminded him that adaptation wasn't just about enduring hardship. It was about learning to find opportunity within constraint, strength within vulnerability, and hope within the most challenging circumstances. 3 weeks into his island residency, David's expanding confidence led him to venture beyond the familiar boundaries of his cove. His daily foraging expeditions had gradually extended further inland, following game trails and water sources deeper into the island's interior. It was during one of these explorations, while tracking what appeared to be a well-used path through a grove of wild banana plants, that he made a discovery that would fundamentally alter his understanding of his situation. The clearing appeared suddenly, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines that parted like a natural doorway. What lay beyond stopped David in his tracks. Someone had been here before, not recently, but not so long ago that time had completely erased the evidence of human presence. The remnants of a camp lay scattered among the trees, partially reclaimed by jungle growth, but still clearly recognizable for what they had been. A ring of fire-blackened stones marked where someone had maintained a cooking fire for an extended period. The rocks showed the telltale staining that came from months or even years of regular use. Nearby, the collapsed framework of what had once been a substantial shelter leaned drunkenly against a large tree. Its palm-thatch roof long since rotted away, but its structural bones still visible. David approached the site with the careful reverence of an archaeologist entering a tomb. Every detail carried significance. Every artifact held potential information about the person who had lived here. How long ago? How long had they stayed? Most importantly, what had happened to them? His systematic search of the campsite yielded a collection of improvised tools and household items that spoke of considerable ingenuity and long-term habitation. A water collection system had been carved into a natural depression in the rocks, designed to catch and channel rainwater into storage containers. Several of these containers, fashioned from large gourds and coconut shells, still remained intact, though weathered and cracked. But it was while examining the base of a large tree that served as one wall of the collapsed shelter that David found the most significant evidence of his predecessor's presence. Carved into the smooth bark, about chest height, were a set of initials and a date, JH 1987. The letters had been cut deep enough to remain clearly visible despite years of tree growth, which had caused the bark to swell around the incisions like scar tissue. David traced the carving with his finger, feeling an unexpected connection to this unknown person who had faced the same challenges, fought the same battles with hunger and isolation, and ultimately left behind only these cryptic initials and a date. JH, a real person with a real name, reduced to 2 letters and a year that placed their stay on the island more than 3 decades ago. The date raised as many questions as it answered. 1987 suggested that JH had been here long before modern GPS tracking and satellite communication made disappearances more difficult to achieve. But what had brought them here? A shipwreck like David's own? Some other misfortune? And perhaps most troubling, what had been their ultimate fate? As David explored the abandoned campsite more thoroughly, he began to appreciate the level of skill and adaptation his predecessor had achieved. The shelter, though collapsed, had been expertly constructed with sophisticated joinery and careful attention to water drainage and wind resistance. The tool collection included items that would have taken considerable time and patience to create. A fish hook carved from bone, a needle made from a large thorn, and various cutting implements fashioned from sharp stones and carefully shaped pieces of metal that might have come from a wrecked vessel. The camp's location revealed strategic thinking, hidden from casual observation but positioned near fresh water and multiple food sources. It offered both security and access to the island's resources. JH had clearly learned the same lessons David was learning, but had carried that knowledge much further toward a permanent adaptation to island life. That evening, David returned to his own camp, with his mind churning with questions and implications. The carved initials had awakened something unsettling, a recognition that his situation might not be as temporary as he'd been assuming. J.H. had clearly been prepared for a long stay, perhaps even a permanent one. The sophistication of their camp suggested years of occupation, not merely weeks or months. As he prepared his evening meal and tended his fire, David found himself studying his own surroundings with new eyes. His shelter, his tools, his daily routines, were these the temporary expedients of a man waiting for rescue, or the beginning foundations of a life that might stretch far longer than he'd ever imagined? The carved initials seemed to watch him from across the distance of decades, a message from the past that carried both encouragement and warning. Someone had survived here, had thrived here, had made a life from nothing but island resources and human determination. But they had also, eventually, left behind only carved letters and scattered artifacts to mark their passage. J.H. had become his invisible mentor, and David realized he needed to learn everything possible from the legacy they had left behind. David returned to J.H.'s abandoned campsite with the methodical determination of a detective investigating a cold case. The discovery of the carved initials had ignited a consuming curiosity about his mysterious predecessor. Who was J.H.? How had they arrived on the island? Most crucially, what had happened to them? The answers, David hoped, lay buried somewhere in the accumulated debris of decades. His second visit revealed details that had escaped his notice during the initial shock of discovery. The campsite was larger than he'd first realized, extending in multiple directions from the central fire ring. Careful examination revealed the remains of what appeared to be different construction phases, suggesting J.H. had lived here long enough to rebuild and expand their living arrangements multiple times. David began a systematic excavation of the area around the collapsed shelter, using a flat piece of driftwood as an improvised shovel. Decades of leaf litter and jungle growth had buried much of the original campsite, but patient digging gradually revealed a treasure trove of artifacts that painted an increasingly detailed picture of J.H.'s island life. The most significant discovery came from beneath a pile of rotted palm fronds near what had once been the shelter's entrance. David's makeshift shovel struck something metallic, and careful brushing away of soil revealed a fishing hook unlike anything he had seen in his explorations of the island. It was clearly handmade, but crafted with such skill and attention to detail that it rivaled anything produced by modern manufacturing. The rusted fishing hook was fashioned from what appeared to be a piece of stainless steel, perhaps salvaged from shipwreck debris. Someone had carefully shaped the metal, filing and grinding it into the perfect curve and point needed for effective fishing. The eye of the hook showed signs of extensive use, polished smooth by countless connections to fishing line. Most remarkably, the hook was still functional despite its age, its point sharp enough to penetrate skin when David tested it cautiously against his thumb. This single artifact represented hours of painstaking work and considerable metallurgical knowledge. J.H. hadn't simply bent a piece of wire into a hook shape. They had created a precision tool that spoke of both desperation and ingenuity. David could imagine the time and effort required to shape raw metal with nothing but stone tools and improvised files. The patient trial and error needed to achieve the correct angles and proportions. With this valuable hook in hand, David's own fishing efforts underwent an immediate transformation. His palm frond traps had provided modest success, but they were passive devices that depended on fish wandering into enclosed areas. The hook opened up active fishing possibilities, allowing him to pursue larger fish in deeper water, where the most substantial catches were likely to be found. He crafted a fishing line from his hand-woven grass rope, carefully unraveling and retwisting the fibers to create a thinner but still strong cord. For bait, he used small pieces of coconut meat and scraps from his previous fish catches. The first expedition with J.H.'s hook proved its worth immediately. Within an hour, David had caught 3 fish larger than any he'd previously managed to trap, but the hook's value extended beyond mere functionality. It represented a direct connection to his predecessor, a tool passed down across decades from one castaway to another. Using it felt like participating in a conversation that spanned the gap between past and present, a sharing of knowledge and experience that made David feel less alone on his island home. The successful fishing expedition encouraged David to expand his archaeological investigation of the campsite. Over the following days, he uncovered additional artifacts that filled in more details of J.H.'s island existence. A collection of carved wooden implements suggested sophisticated food preparation techniques. Stone tools showed evidence of careful shaping and sharpening. Most intriguingly, he found what appeared to be the remains of a more advanced shelter foundation, suggesting J.H. had progressed to increasingly sophisticated construction projects. Each discovery raised new questions while answering others. The quality and variety of tools suggested J.H. had possessed considerable wilderness skills, possibly military or professional outdoor experience. The evidence of multiple construction phases indicated a stay of years rather than months. But perhaps most puzzling was the apparent sudden abandonment of the site. Tools and equipment left scattered as if J.H. had departed quickly. Possibly unexpectedly, David established a routine of spending his mornings at his own camp, maintaining his survival needs, and his afternoons exploring J.H.'s site. The rusted fishing hook became his most prized possession, carefully cleaned and maintained after each use. It hung from a cord around his neck, both practical tool and talisman, connecting him to the island's hidden history. As weeks passed, David found himself talking to J.H. during his solitary work, sharing observations about island life and asking questions that would never receive answers. The one-sided conversations helped combat the psychological pressure of complete isolation while strengthening his sense of connection to someone who had walked this same path of adaptation and survival. The fishing hook was proof that human ingenuity could triumph over the most challenging circumstances, and that knowledge and tools could outlive their creators to benefit future generations. David's archaeological excavations of J.H.'s campsite had become a daily obsession, each new discovery adding another piece to an increasingly complex puzzle. It was during his 4th week of investigation that he uncovered something that would fundamentally change his understanding of his predecessor's methodical nature and scientific approach to island survival. The discovery came while he was clearing vegetation from what appeared to be a secondary work area, about 50 yards from the main shelter site. Hidden beneath decades of accumulated leaf litter and partially overgrown by creeping vines, David found a deliberate arrangement of stones that defied natural explanation. 24 rocks of similar size had been placed in a perfect circle, each one carefully positioned and showing clear evidence of human placement. But this wasn't simply a decorative stone circle. As David studied the arrangement more carefully, he began to recognize a sophisticated system embedded in its design. Certain stones were taller than others, creating a pattern that seemed to correspond to celestial observations. One particularly prominent stone, pointed directly toward what David had determined was magnetic north, based on his observations of the sun's path. Another aligned perfectly with the sunrise position during the island's dry season. The stone circle arrangement revealed J.H. as someone far more systematic and scientific than David had initially imagined. This wasn't just a survival camp. It was an observatory, a calendar, and a navigation aid all rolled into one ingenious construction. The more David studied it, the more complex patterns emerged. Some stones appeared to mark seasonal changes, others tracked lunar phases, and still others seemed to indicate optimal times for various island activities. David spent an entire day mapping the stone circle and trying to decode its meaning. He sketched the arrangement from multiple angles, noted the directional alignments and began to understand how JH had used this tool to impose order and predictability on island life. The circle suggested someone with considerable knowledge of astronomy and navigation, possibly a sailor or pilot, who had found themselves stranded far from their intended destination. The sophistication of the calendar system implied something David hadn't fully grasped until now. JH had been planning for a very long stay, possibly permanent residence. Someone expecting imminent rescue wouldn't invest the time and effort required to create such an elaborate timekeeping system. This was the work of someone who had accepted their situation and was building infrastructure for years or decades of island life. David began incorporating JH's calendar into his own daily routine, checking the stone alignments each morning and evening to better understand the island's seasonal patterns. The system revealed subtle changes in weather, tides, and animal behavior that David had been missing in his focus on immediate survival needs. For instance, the calendar predicted a shift in fish migration patterns that proved accurate within days, allowing David to adjust his fishing locations and techniques accordingly. The calendar also revealed the approaching dry season, something David had been unconsciously dreading, without fully understanding why. JH's stone markers indicated that the regular afternoon rain showers that had become part of David's daily rhythm would gradually diminish over the coming weeks. This knowledge allowed him to begin expanding his water storage capabilities and identifying alternative water sources before the change became critical. As David integrated JH's observations into his own survival strategies, he felt an increasing sense of partnership with his invisible predecessor. The stone circle became a meeting place where David would sit each evening, studying the alignments and feeling connected to someone who had faced the same challenges with such remarkable intelligence and foresight. The calendar system also deepened the mystery of JH's ultimate fate. Someone who had invested so much effort in long-term survival planning, who had created such sophisticated tools and systems, seemed unlikely to have simply abandoned everything without compelling reason. Had rescue finally arrived after years of waiting? Had JH decided to attempt an escape by sea? Or had some other factor forced their departure from this carefully constructed island home? David found himself spending hours contemplating these questions while studying the stone arrangements. The calendar had become more than just a practical tool. It was a window into JH's mind, revealing someone of remarkable resilience and intelligence who had transformed a survival situation into something approaching civilization. Each evening, as David checked the stone alignments and updated his own mental calendar, he felt the weight of continuing JH's work. The stone circle had survived decades of weather and jungle encroachment, a testament to both its solid construction and the enduring human need to measure time and impose order on the natural world. The calendar reminded David that survival wasn't just about staying alive from day to day. It was about creating systems and structures that could sustain life over extended periods. JH had understood this principle and had built accordingly, leaving behind tools and knowledge that continued to serve their purpose long after their creator had vanished into history. Through the stone circle, David was learning to think beyond immediate needs and consider the long-term requirements of island life, a shift in perspective that felt both liberating and sobering. David's most significant discovery came not through systematic excavation, but by pure accident. While collecting firewood in a grove of trees near JH's calendar site, he stepped on what felt like a flat piece of bark. When he bent to move it aside, he realized he was looking at something far more precious than any tool or artifact he'd yet uncovered. A piece of paper, weathered and water-stained, but still partially legible. The fragment appeared to be part of a larger notebook, perhaps 6 inches square, with writing visible on both sides. The paper was brown with age and moisture damage, its edges soft and crumbling, but someone had taken care to protect it within what remained of a crude, waterproof covering made from tree bark and plant resin. This preservation effort had allowed portions of the text to survive decades of tropical weather. David carried the water-damaged notebook pages back to his camp with the careful reverence of someone handling a sacred relic. Under the light of his fire, he began the painstaking process of deciphering J.H.'s handwriting. The ink had faded, and water damage had rendered many passages illegible, but enough remained to provide crucial insights into his predecessor's experiences and observations. The legible portions revealed J.H. as someone methodical and observant, recording not just daily events, but detailed observations about island life that would prove invaluable for survival. One passage, written in careful block letters, warned about a section of reef on the island's north shore where dangerous currents and sharp coral made fishing attempts extremely hazardous. Another entry described seasonal changes in fruit availability, noting that certain trees produced food only during specific months. Most significantly, David found detailed notes about water sources beyond the stream he'd been relying on. J.H. had mapped several springs and seasonal pools throughout the island's interior, complete with notes about water quality and accessibility during different weather conditions. This information expanded David's understanding of the island's geography and provided backup options for his most critical survival need. The journal fragment also contained observations about the island's animal life that helped explain some mysteries David had encountered. J.H. had noted the presence of wild pigs in the island's interior, explaining the game trails David had been following. More importantly, the notes described their behavior patterns and suggested hunting strategies that might prove successful with proper preparation and patience. Weather patterns received considerable attention in J.H.'s notes. The journal described a severe, dry season that could last several months, during which the reliable afternoon rains would cease almost entirely. This information validated what David had learned from the stone calendar and provided specific guidance about water, conservation and alternative food sources during the challenging period. But perhaps the most intriguing entries dealt with J.H.'s observations about the island's isolation. Several passages suggested that while the island appeared on no maps, it wasn't entirely unknown to the outside world. J.H. had apparently observed aircraft passing overhead on irregular schedules, noting their directions and approximate altitudes. These observations suggested possible shipping or air routes that might be exploited for rescue signaling. The journal entries painted a picture of someone far more hopeful about eventual rescue than David had expected. Rather than the desperate scribblings of someone resigned to permanent exile, J.H.'s notes showed careful planning for both long-term survival and potential rescue opportunities. The writing demonstrated someone who had accepted their situation without surrendering, hope for eventual return to civilization. Technical knowledge filled many of the surviving passages. J.H. had documented various plant species and their uses, from medicinal applications to construction materials. David found detailed descriptions of fish behavior and optimal fishing locations that immediately improved his own success rates. Most valuable were notes about food preservation, techniques that would allow him to build up reserves for the coming dry season. The journal fragment also revealed J.H.'s personality more clearly than any artifact could. The writing showed someone with considerable education and scientific training, possibly a marine biologist or oceanographer, based on the sophisticated understanding of tidal patterns and marine ecology. There were references to professional colleagues and research projects that suggested J.H. had been involved in legitimate scientific work before becoming stranded. Reading J.H.'s careful observations and methodical planning, David felt a complex mixture of gratitude and sadness. This unknown person had faced the same fears and challenges, had developed solutions through painful trial and error, and had thoughtfully recorded that knowledge for potential future castaways. Yet the very existence of the journal raised troubling questions about J.H.'s ultimate fate. Each evening, David carefully studied the journal pages by firelight, memorizing crucial information and cross-referencing it with his own observations. The notes became a survival manual written specifically for this island, more valuable than any published wilderness guide because they address the unique challenges and opportunities of this particular environment. The water-damaged notebook pages transformed J.H. from a mysterious predecessor into a real person whose intelligence, determination, and generosity continued to contribute to David's survival decades after they had been written. Armed with the geographical knowledge gleaned from J.H.'s journal fragments, David embarked on his most ambitious exploration yet, a trek to the island's highest point. The journal had mentioned aircraft sightings and suggested that elevated positions offered the best opportunities for signaling potential rescuers. After 6 weeks of focusing primarily on immediate survival needs, David felt ready to consider longer-term escape possibilities. The climb to the island's interior proved more challenging than his coastal explorations. The terrain rose steeply from the familiar lowlands, requiring him to navigate dense jungle growth, unstable volcanic rock formations, and several stream crossings where swift water had carved deep channels through the landscape. His improved physical condition, developed through weeks of constant activity and basic nutrition, served him well during the demanding ascent. Following one of J.H.'s mapped routes, David discovered a series of natural steps carved into the volcanic stone by centuries of erosion. The trail switchbacked up the mountainside, occasionally opening onto breathtaking vistas of the surrounding ocean that stretched unbroken to every horizon. From these vantage points, the true isolation of his situation became starkly apparent. No other land was visible in any direction, just endless blue water meeting empty sky near the summit, hidden among a cluster of weathered rocks and stunted trees that had somehow found purchase in the thin soil. David made a discovery that sent chills down his spine, despite the tropical heat. Carefully positioned to catch and reflect sunlight, a homemade signal mirror lay wedged between two boulders like a metallic flower blooming from stone. The polished piece of metal was clearly J.H.'s work, fashioned from what appeared to be part of a larger sheet of stainless steel and carefully shaped into an effective signaling device. The surface had been polished to mirror brightness, using techniques that must have required countless hours of patient effort with improvised abrasives. Small holes drilled near one edge allowed the mirror to be aimed precisely by sighting through them toward aircraft or ships. The mirror's positioning revealed strategic thinking that impressed David with its sophistication. J.H. had chosen a location that offered commanding views in all directions while remaining concealed from casual observation. The device could be operated quickly by someone who reached this position in response to aircraft sounds. Yet it wouldn't be visible to passing vessels unless deliberately activated. Evidence around the mirror site suggested it had been used regularly over an extended period. Worn paths approached from multiple directions, allowing quick access regardless of weather conditions or time of day. A small shelter constructed from piled stones provided protection for someone who might need to wait extended periods for signaling opportunities. Most tellingly, David found the remains of a crude but effective fire pit, designed to produce smoke signals as a backup. Communication method. The signal mirror represented a level of hope and determination that both inspired and sobered David. J.H. had clearly spent considerable time and effort preparing for rescue opportunities. Yet the mirror remained here, abandoned like everything else from that mysterious predecessor's island life. The device's presence raised uncomfortable questions about the effectiveness of rescue signaling from such an isolated location. David tested the mirror's functionality and found it remarkably effective. Even slight movements created brilliant flashes of reflected sunlight that could be seen for miles. Under the right conditions, JH had crafted not just a signaling device, but a precision instrument capable of sending messages across vast distances. The technical skill required to create such an effective tool spoke again to JH's probable professional background in navigation or marine science. From the summit position, David gained his first comprehensive view of the island's full extent. The landmass was larger than he'd realized, perhaps 8 miles long and 4 miles wide, with several smaller satellite islands visible in the distance. The geography was more complex than his ground-level explorations had suggested, with multiple valleys, hidden coves, and elevated plateaus that could harbor additional resources or shelter sites. The 360-degree view also revealed several potential rescue signaling locations beyond the summit. Rocky promontories jutting into the ocean could serve as signal fires, visible from great distances. Beach areas with light-colored sand might be suitable for creating ground signals visible to aircraft. JH's journal had mentioned these possibilities, but seeing them firsthand allowed David to begin formulating his own rescue plans. As afternoon shadows lengthened, David carefully repositioned the signal mirror in its original location before beginning his descent. The device would remain ready for immediate use should aircraft sounds provide signaling opportunities, continuing its patient vigil just as JH had intended decades earlier. The trek back to his coastal camp took on a different character after the summit exploration. David now understood the island as a complete ecosystem, rather than just the small portion he'd been inhabiting. The knowledge was both empowering and overwhelming. There was so much more to explore, so many resources to discover, so many possibilities to investigate. The signal mirror haunted his thoughts during the descent, a symbol of hope tempered by the sobering reality that even the most sophisticated preparation couldn't guarantee rescue from such complete isolation. David's exploration of the island's elevated interior had revealed numerous caves and rock shelters that JH's journal had only briefly mentioned. Driven by curiosity and the approaching dry season that would make alternative shelter increasingly valuable, David spent several days investigating these natural formations. It was in the largest of these caves, protected from wind and rain by a natural stone overhang, that he made the discovery that would finally solve the mystery of JH's fate. The cave extended much deeper into the mountainside than David had initially realized. Using a torch made from coconut fiber and tree resin, he pushed beyond the entrance chamber into a series of connected rooms that showed clear evidence of human habitation. Someone had used this space extensively, not as temporary shelter, but as a workshop and storage facility for an ambitious long-term project. In the cave's deepest reachable chamber, David's torchlight revealed something that stopped him in his tracks. Carefully preserved in the dry, protected environment, he found what appeared to be the final entry in JH's journal, a complete, undamaged page that had been deliberately placed in a waterproof container made from sealed bark and tree resin. The final journal entry was dated nearly 2 years after the earliest fragments David had found, suggesting JH had remained on the island far longer than he'd initially imagined. But more significantly, the page contained detailed plans and observations about a project that explained both JH's disappearance and the careful preservation of this final record. After 3 years of careful observation and preparation, the entry began. I believe the seasonal wind patterns and current flows offer a realistic opportunity for reaching the shipping lanes approximately 200 nautical miles southeast of this position. The raft design has been tested extensively in the island's protected waters and shows adequate stability and buoyancy for extended ocean travel. David, read the page 3 times before the full implications settled in. JH had not simply accepted permanent exile on the island. They had spent years planning and preparing for an escape attempt by sea. The journal entry detailed weather windows, navigation techniques, and provisioning strategies for an ambitious ocean voyage that would either lead to rescue or death. The entry described the raft as a sophisticated vessel, incorporating lessons learned from 3 years of island survival. JH had apparently constructed multiple test versions before settling on a final design that balanced stability, cargo capacity, and speed. The description included details about sail configuration, steering systems, and emergency procedures that revealed considerable nautical knowledge and practical experience. Most remarkably, the journal entry expressed neither desperation nor false optimism, but rather the calculated assessment of someone who had carefully weighed risks against potential rewards. JH acknowledged the dangers of the planned voyage while explaining why remaining on the island indefinitely was ultimately a less acceptable option than attempting the hazardous ocean crossing. "I leave this record," the entry concluded, "for anyone who might follow the same path I have traveled. The island can sustain human life indefinitely for those willing to adapt and learn from its offerings. But for those who choose to seek return to the larger world, the knowledge contained in my observations may prove valuable." The choice between acceptance and risk must be made by each person, according to their own nature and circumstances. David carefully refolded the journal page and secured it in his own improvised waterproof container. The discovery answered the fundamental question that had puzzled him for weeks. JH had not died on the island or been rescued by passing vessels. They had deliberately chosen to risk everything on a carefully planned escape attempt, disappearing into the vast Pacific in pursuit of freedom. The revelation fundamentally altered David's understanding of his own situation. For weeks, he had been operating under the assumption that rescue would eventually arrive if he simply survived long enough and maintained adequate signaling capabilities. JH's example suggested a different perspective, that survival itself might not be enough, that active pursuit of rescue might be necessary regardless of the risks involved. The cave workshop area supported the journal's claims about raft construction. David found evidence of extensive woodworking activities, including shaped timbers that had apparently been rejected for various flaws, cordage experiments using different plant fibers, and even primitive tools for working metal salvaged from shipwreck debris. The scope of the project was impressive, suggesting months or years of careful preparation. Near the workshop area, David discovered what appeared to be provisions that had been prepared for the ocean voyage, but ultimately left behind. Dried fruits and fish, carefully preserved in waterproof containers, remained edible after decades of storage. Water containers fashioned from gourds and sealed with tree resins showed sophisticated understanding of long-term preservation techniques. The final journal entry had transformed JH from mysterious predecessor to inspiring example. Someone had faced the same isolation, developed the same survival skills, and ultimately chosen action over passive acceptance. Whether that choice had led to rescue or death remained unknown, but the courage and determination it represented offered David a new perspective on his own options. The journal page became David's most treasured possession, not just for its practical information, but for its demonstration that even the most challenging circumstances need not define the limits of human possibility. JH's final journal entry had ignited a fire of possibility in David's mind, but it also forced him to confront the most difficult decision of his island residency. The revelation that escape was possible, that someone had actually attempted it with careful planning and reasonable preparation, transformed his situation from passive survival to active choice. Should he follow JH's example and risk everything on an ocean voyage, or accept the island as his permanent home and focus on long-term survival? The internal debate consumed David's thoughts as he explored the coastal areas where JH had apparently constructed and launched the escape raft. Following clues from the journal entry and his own careful observation of tide patterns and beach access, David located what could only be described as a primitive shipyard hidden in a protected cove on the island's leeward side. The site revealed the scope and sophistication of JH's raft construction project. A partially built raft frame still lay among the mangrove roots, its skeletal structure providing crucial insights into the design philosophy that had guided the escape attempt. The frame was larger than David had expected, perhaps 12 feet long and 6 feet wide, suggesting a vessel designed for extended ocean travel rather than a desperate improvised escape. The partially built raft frame showed evidence of sophisticated engineering adapted to available materials. The main structure consisted of carefully selected hardwood logs, lashed together with what appeared to be multiple layers of plant fiber rope. Cross braces and reinforcing members had been positioned to distribute loads and provide structural integrity under the stresses of ocean travel. Even incomplete, the design demonstrated understanding of naval architecture, principles that impressed David with their technical sophistication. JH had apparently tested various construction techniques extensively before settling on the final design. David found evidence of multiple smaller raft prototypes, each showing progressive improvements in design and construction methods. The evolution of these test vessels revealed someone who approached the escape project with scientific methodology, treating each prototype as an experiment that informed the next iteration. The construction site also contained tools and materials that would have been essential for raft building, but were far beyond anything David had yet created. Sophisticated adzes carved from hard stone, metal files shaped from salvaged materials, and measuring devices fashioned from straight branches showed the level of preparation J.H. had invested in the project. These tools represented months or years of development, each one carefully crafted for specific tasks in the raft construction process. But the skeletal raft frame also served as a sobering reminder of the risks involved in J.H.'s escape attempt. The ocean beyond the island's protective reefs was vast and unforgiving, offering no margin for error in navigation, weather assessment, or equipment failure. David had enough sailing experience to understand the magnitude of the challenge J.H. had undertaken, a 200-mile ocean voyage in a handmade raft with improvised navigation, equipment, and limited provisions. David studied the abandoned construction site. He found himself calculating his own capabilities against the requirements of such a project. His wilderness experience provided relevant skills, but raft construction and ocean navigation demanded specialized knowledge he wasn't certain he possessed. The technical sophistication of J.H.'s work suggested someone with considerably more maritime experience than David could claim. The approaching dry season added urgency to his decision-making process. J.H.'s journal had indicated that the optimal weather window for ocean travel occurred during the transition between seasons, when trade winds provided consistent but manageable conditions for sailing. Missing this opportunity might mean waiting an entire year for the next favorable period. Assuming David could survive the challenging months ahead, David spent long hours each day at the construction site, studying J.H.'s techniques and trying to understand the principles behind the raft design. He experimented with lashing techniques, tested different wood types for their buoyancy and durability, and gradually began to appreciate the complexity of creating a seaworthy vessel from island materials. The learning curve was steep, but not impossibly so for someone willing to invest the necessary time and effort. The emotional weight of the decision proved as challenging as the technical considerations. The island had become home in ways David hadn't expected when he first washed ashore months earlier. His shelter, his daily routines, his growing mastery of the island's resources, all of this represented security and familiarity that would be abandoned if he chose to follow J.H.'s path, yet the alternative, accepting permanent exile on the island, carried its own emotional and psychological costs. David's family and friends had no way of knowing whether he was alive or dead. His life's work, his relationships, his place in the larger world had all been severed by his disappearance. The island offered survival, but it couldn't provide the human connections and sense of purpose that had given meaning to his previous existence. The partially built raft frame became David's daily companion as he wrestled with this fundamental choice. Each morning, he would sit beside the weathered structure and try to imagine himself completing JH's work, launching the finished vessel into the unknown ocean, and trusting his life to winds and currents beyond his control. The decision crystallized during David's morning ritual of checking the stone calendar and observing weather patterns. 7 weeks had passed since discovering JH's final journal entry, 7 weeks of internal debate that had become increasingly urgent as the optimal departure window approached. According to both the stone calendar and his own meteorological observations, the seasonal wind shift that would provide the best conditions for ocean travel was only days away. David had spent those weeks in intensive preparation, not yet committed to departure, but unwilling to miss the opportunity through lack of readiness. He had studied every aspect of JH's raft design, practiced essential knots and lashing techniques, and gathered materials that would be needed for construction. The process had become its own form of meditation, allowing him to work through the emotional and practical implications of his choice while keeping his options open. But preparation time was ending. The weather patterns showed the first signs of the seasonal transition JH had identified as crucial for successful ocean travel. Trade winds were becoming more consistent, storm systems were tracking further north, and the ocean swells were moderating into the regular patterns that would provide the most favorable sailing conditions. Within another week, these optimal conditions would begin to deteriorate, and the window would close until the following year. Standing beside the large tree that bore JH's carved initials, David made his own mark in the weathered bark. Using his pocket knife, he carefully cut his own initials below those of his predecessor, adding the current date and a brief message. DM 2024, following your path. The carved farewell message represented his acceptance of the risks ahead and his decision to honor JH's example of choosing action over passive acceptance. The carving process felt ceremonial, a formal commitment that transformed weeks of internal debate into concrete action. As he worked the knife through the tough bark, David reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The frightened castaway who had awakened on the beach 2 months earlier had evolved into someone capable of attempting one of the most challenging survival endeavors imaginable. His preparations had extended beyond raft construction to include detailed planning for the possibility that he might not survive the ocean crossing. Following JH's example, David had created a comprehensive survival guide for any future castaways who might find themselves on the island. The guide detailed everything he had learned about water sources, food procurement, shelter construction, and tool making, along with his own observations about seasonal patterns and resource availability. The survival manual also included careful maps of the island's geography, marking dangerous areas to avoid and productive locations for various survival activities. David had invested considerable time in creating accurate sketches of edible and medicinal plants, complete with notes about preparation methods and seasonal availability. Most importantly, he had documented the locations of JH's artifacts and tools, ensuring that future castaways could benefit from both their accumulated knowledge. The guide was written on bark panels using charcoal ink, with each section carefully protected in waterproof containers and cached in multiple locations around the island. The redundant storage ensured that the information would survive, even if individual caches were destroyed by weather or other factors. David had also carved summary information into several prominent trees, providing basic survival guidance that would remain visible even if the detailed guides were lost. Creating the survival manual had forced David to confront the reality that his escape attempt might fail. that he might join J.H. in whatever fate had claimed his predecessor. But rather than discouraging the attempt, this acknowledgement had strengthened his resolve. J.H. had faced the same risks and had chosen courage over security, action over acceptance. The carved initials in the tree bark connected David to that tradition of determination and hope. The farewell preparations also included improvements to his existing shelter and resource systems, designed to serve any future inhabitants of the island. David had expanded the water collection and storage capacity, created additional tool caches, and established multiple shelter sites that could provide immediate refuge for new arrivals. These improvements represented both practical preparation and emotional insurance against the guilt of abandoning resources that might be desperately needed by others. As David completed his carved message and stepped back to examine his work, he felt the weight of finality settling over his island residence. Tomorrow, he would begin the intensive construction phase that would transform J.H.'s abandoned raft frame into a seaworthy vessel. Within a week, if all went according to plan, he would launch that vessel into the vast Pacific and trust his life to winds, currents, and whatever navigation skills he could master in the remaining time. The carved farewell message would remain as his own contribution to the island's human history, a marker of another person who had faced impossible circumstances and chosen to reach for hope rather than accept limitation. The intensity of raft construction consumed David's every waking hour once his decision was made. Working from J.H.'s abandoned frame and the detailed notes in the journal fragments, he threw himself into the project with desperate energy, knowing that each passing day brought him closer to the end of the optimal weather window. The work was physically demanding and technically challenging, requiring him to master skills he had never imagined needing when he first set foot on the island. J.H.'s partially completed frame provided an excellent foundation, but significant work remained before the vessel would be seaworthy. David began by carefully examining each lashing point and structural connection, testing the integrity of knots that had weathered decades of tropical conditions. Some of the original ropework needed replacement, requiring him to manufacture new cordage using the plant fiber, techniques he had perfected over months of island life. The most challenging aspect of construction proved to be creating a watertight deck and storage compartments. J.H.'s design called for a sophisticated system of woven palm panels sealed with tree resin, creating dry storage space for provisions and fresh water during the ocean voyage. David spent 3 days perfecting the weaving technique, creating panels tight enough to shed water, while remaining flexible enough to accommodate the raft's movement in heavy seas. But it was while working on the raft's most sophisticated component, a fishing net designed to provide food during the voyage, that David experienced his most profound moment of doubt about the entire escape attempt. The perfected fishing net represented the culmination of all his island survival skills, woven from the finest plant fibers he could produce and designed, with knowledge gained through months of successful fishing experience. The net was a work of art, as much as a tool, its mesh pattern carefully calculated to catch fish of optimal size, while allowing smaller specimens to escape. David had invested weeks in gathering the materials and perfecting the technique, creating what was arguably the most sophisticated piece of equipment in his entire survival inventory. The net could reliably provide protein indefinitely, making him virtually independent of the island's other food sources. As he held the completed net, testing its strength and admiring its craftsmanship, David was struck by a troubling realization. This tool, along with all the other survival systems he had developed, represented security and capability that would be abandoned if he followed through with the ocean voyage. The island had become not just his prison, but his domain, a place where he had achieved a level of mastery and self-sufficiency that bordered on complete independence. The fishing net symbolized this mastery in tangible form. Using it, David could catch enough fish to support himself comfortably while maintaining the energy needed for other survival activities. Combined with his knowledge of the island's plant resources, his sophisticated water collection systems, and his improved shelter construction, the net made him genuinely successful as an island survivor rather than merely someone managing to stay alive. This success created an unexpected psychological barrier to departure. David had invested months in learning the island's secrets, developing relationships with its ecosystems, and building infrastructure that supported increasingly comfortable existence. Leaving would mean abandoning not just security but accomplishment, trading proven capability for unknown risks and uncertain outcomes. The internal conflict intensified as construction progressed. Each improvement to the raft represented commitment to departure. But each day spent working on the vessel was also a day spent away from maintaining and improving his island systems. David found himself torn between excitement about the approaching voyage and reluctance to abandon a life that had become genuinely satisfying in unexpected ways. Weather observations added to his mounting anxiety. While the seasonal patterns remained favorable for ocean travel, David's growing meteorological awareness revealed subtle variations that could spell the difference between successful navigation and catastrophic failure. A slight shift in wind direction could blow him away from the shipping lanes he hoped to reach. Changes in current patterns could extend the voyage beyond his ability to carry adequate provisions. The fishing net became his daily reminder of this fundamental dilemma. Each evening, as he worked on final raft preparations, David would handle the net and consider its implications. The tool represented everything he would be giving up: security, competence, a life he had built through his own efforts and ingenuity. Yet it also represented the skills and knowledge that might allow him to survive the ocean crossing and return to the world he had lost. Technical problems with the raft construction provided welcome distraction from these psychological struggles. The sail system required multiple attempts before David achieved a configuration that would provide adequate propulsion without overwhelming the vessel's stability. Navigation equipment demanded improvisation and testing, as David tried to recreate the compass and sighting tools that would be essential for maintaining course during the voyage. As the construction phase neared completion, David realized that his internal debate was approaching its own conclusion. The perfected fishing net would either accompany him on the ocean voyage or remain behind as another tool for future castaways. But the choice between security and freedom could no longer be postponed indefinitely. Dawn on departure day arrived, with the kind of perfect weather that David had been hoping for throughout weeks of preparation. Light offshore winds, calm seas, and crystal-clear visibility combined to create conditions that seemed almost too ideal to trust. As he performed his final equipment checks and loaded provisions onto the completed raft, David fought against the superstitious feeling that such perfect conditions might be nature's way of luring him into overconfidence. The finished raft represented 2 months of intensive learning and construction, incorporating lessons from J.H.'s original design with improvements based on David's own observations and experience. At 12 feet long and 7 feet wide, the vessel was larger than J.H.'s frame had suggested, built for stability and cargo capacity rather than speed. The deck construction had consumed countless hours, but the result was a platform that remained dry even when waves washed over the sides. David's most crucial innovation was the emergency paddle he had carved from the island's hardest wood. Unlike the lightweight paddles suitable for calm water maneuvering, this implement was designed to function under extreme conditions when sail power became inadequate or dangerous. The paddle was nearly 6 feet long, shaped for maximum efficiency and carved with hand. Grips that would remain secure even when wet and under stress. The emergency paddle represented more than just practical and preparation. It was David's final tangible connection to the island that had been his home for nearly 3 months. The wood came from a tree that grew near his original shelter site, and he had shaped it using tools developed through his island survival experience. Every aspect of the paddle's construction reflected knowledge and skills that would have been meaningless to him before his castaway experience, but had now become essential capabilities. Loading provisions onto the raft required careful weight distribution and waterproof storage techniques that David had practiced repeatedly during construction. Fresh water, stored in sealed gourds and coconut shells, occupied the most protected compartments. Dried fish and preserved fruits, prepared using methods learned from J.H.'s notes, filled additional storage spaces. The perfected fishing net, folded carefully to prevent tangling, lay ready for deployment once the raft reached deeper waters. The launch procedure itself proved more challenging than David had anticipated. The raft's substantial weight required careful coordination between tidal conditions and manual effort to move it from the construction site to navigable water. David had built log rollers and prepared a launch track, but the final transition from beach to ocean still required every ounce of strength and determination he could muster. As the raft finally floated free from the beach, David experienced a complex mixture of emotions that he hadn't expected. Relief at successful completion of the construction project combined with excitement about the voyage ahead, but both were tempered by an unexpected sense of loss. The island that had seemed like a prison when he first arrived had become a home where he had discovered capabilities and strengths he hadn't known he possessed. The first few minutes of sailing provided immediate validation of the raft's design and construction. The vessel responded predictably to wind and paddle inputs, maintaining stability even as small waves began testing its seaworthiness. David's sail configuration, copied from J.H.'s notes but modified based on his own observations of wind patterns, provided adequate propulsion without overwhelming the raft's steering capabilities. Navigation proved to be the most mentally demanding aspect of the early voyage. Using an improvised compass created from a magnetized sewing needle and his knowledge of celestial navigation basics, David attempted to maintain a course toward the shipping lanes that J.H.'s journal had identified as offering the best rescue opportunities. The process required constant attention to wind direction, current drift, and the position of the sun, leaving little mental energy for reflection or anxiety. Physical demands of ocean sailing became apparent within the first hour. Maintaining course required continuous adjustments to sail trim and paddle position, keeping David actively engaged with the raft's operation. The constant motion, while not uncomfortable, demanded a different kind of balance and body awareness than his island activities had required. His hands, calloused from months of survival work, began developing new pressure points where they gripped the emergency paddle and sail lines. The island gradually diminished behind him as David maintained his southeasterly course toward the distant shipping lanes. From sea level, the familiar landmarks disappeared much more quickly than he had expected, forcing him to rely entirely on navigation techniques rather than visual references. Within 2 hours, the island had become a low smudge on the northern horizon, and by afternoon, it had vanished entirely. The psychological impact of losing sight of the island was more profound than David had anticipated. For 3 months, that land had represented security, resources, and familiar territory, where he had developed genuine competence. Now it was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of blue water that offered no landmarks, no familiar reference points, and no possibility of retreat. The emergency paddle, slicing through water that stretched unbroken to every horizon, became his anchor to purpose and direction as the vast Pacific Ocean embraced his small craft. The second day of David's ocean voyage began with a lesson in the fundamental difference between island survival and ocean navigation. While his island experience had taught him to read natural signs and adapt to changing conditions, the ocean operated by rules that were both more predictable and more unforgiving than anything he had encountered on land. The gentle morning breeze that had carried him steadily through his first day at sea began shifting by mid-morning, forcing him to confront the reality that weather patterns could change much more rapidly over open water than they did near land. By noon, the wind had increased from a comfortable sailing breeze to something approaching storm conditions. Waves that had been manageable swells during the morning grew into challenging barriers that required constant attention to navigate safely. David found himself fighting, not just to maintain his southeasterly course, but simply to keep the raft stable and dry as increasingly large waves swept across his route. The makeshift sail that had seemed so effective during construction and initial testing became a liability as wind strength increased. David had fashioned the sail from his own shirt and various salvaged materials, creating a patchwork that functioned adequately under calm conditions but lacked the strength and adjustability needed for heavy weather sailing. The fabric strained against its supports, and several of the attachment points began showing signs of stress that threatened complete failure. David's first major crisis came when a particularly large wave struck the raft at an angle that overwhelmed his steering capabilities. The impact twisted the vessel sharply, putting enormous stress on the lashing that held the basic structure together. He heard the distinctive sound of plant fiber rope beginning to stretch and snap under load, followed by an alarming shift in the raft's stability as structural members began moving independently, rather than as a unified platform. Emergency repairs under sailing conditions required skills and techniques that no amount of island survival experience had prepared him for. David was forced to work while maintaining his grip on steering paddle and sail lines, using one hand to tighten critical lashings, while the other fought to keep the raft from capsizing in the increasingly rough seas. The process was exhausting, dangerous, and only partially successful. He managed to restore basic structural integrity but couldn't address all of the stress damage. Without stopping completely, the decision to reduce sail and ride out the deteriorating weather rather than continue pushing toward his destination required David to abandon his carefully calculated navigation schedule. J.H.'s journal had emphasized the importance of maintaining consistent progress toward the shipping lanes, but the current conditions made such progress impossible without risking catastrophic damage to the raft's structure or sailing systems. As afternoon merged into evening, David found himself in survival mode rather than navigation mode. The makeshift sail had been reduced to its smallest possible configuration, providing just enough power to maintain steering control while minimizing stress on the weakened rigging. His emergency paddle became the primary means of maintaining course, requiring constant effort that left his arms and shoulders aching with fatigue. The ocean's immensity became overwhelming as darkness approached, and David realized he would have to spend his first night at sea under challenging conditions rather than the calm weather he had hoped for. Without familiar landmarks or the security of solid ground, every sound and motion took on exaggerated significance. The raft's movements, which had seemed manageable during daylight, became sources of anxiety as David struggled to distinguish between normal sailing motion and signs of structural failure. Navigation by starlight proved nearly impossible under the current conditions. Cloud cover obscured many of the celestial references David had planned to use for course correction, while the raft's constant motion made accurate sighting difficult even when stars were visible. He was forced to rely primarily on his compass and dead reckoning, techniques that accumulated error over time and offered no way to verify accuracy until daylight returned. The fishing net that had represented such security during his island residence became useless under the current conditions. Deploying it would have been impossible in the rough seas, and even if fishing had been feasible, David's complete attention was required for sailing and raft maintenance. The ocean that had seemed full of potential food sources from the island's perspective now appeared as a hostile environment. where basic survival took precedence over any thought of supplementing his stored provisions. Sleep became impossible as the night progressed, and weather conditions continued to deteriorate. David found himself in a constant state of alertness, monitoring the raft's condition and making adjustments to sailing configuration in response to changing wind and wave patterns. The makeshift sail required frequent attention as stress points shifted and attachment systems worked loose under the constant strain. By dawn of his third day at sea, David had gained a profound appreciation for the magnitude of the challenge he had undertaken. The ocean voyage that had seemed achievable during planning and preparation phases had revealed itself as an endeavor that would test every aspect of his physical and mental endurance. Dawn of the fourth day brought with it a sight that David had almost stopped believing he would ever see, a thin line of smoke on the distant horizon that could only mean one thing: a ship. After 3 days of battling deteriorating weather conditions, equipment failures, and the growing realization that his navigation might have carried him away from rather than toward the shipping lanes, the appearance of another vessel seemed almost miraculous. David's hands shook as he reached for the rescue flare he had carefully protected throughout the voyage. The device was one of 3 he had managed to create using materials salvaged from his original shipwreck, combined with chemical compounds he had extracted from various island plants through a process described in J.H.'s notes. The flares represented his primary means of signaling rescue vessels, but their effectiveness depended entirely on being spotted by someone who would recognize them as distress signals rather than natural phenomena. The rescue flare had become more than just a signaling device during his ocean ordeal. It represented hope itself, the tangible proof that rescue remained possible even under the most challenging circumstances. David had protected the flares with obsessive care, keeping them dry and ready for instant use while fighting through storms and equipment failures that had threatened every other aspect of his survival preparations. Distant ship appeared to be following a course that would bring it within visual range, but not close enough for automatic detection of a small raft. David would have perhaps 30 minutes to signal successfully before the vessel passed beyond effective signaling distance. The timing would be critical. Too early, and the flare might not be visible in daylight. Too late, and the ship would be gone forever. David waited until the vessel was clearly visible as a cargo ship before igniting his first flare. The device performed exactly as hoped, producing a brilliant red streak of light that arced high above his position before exploding in a shower of colored sparks, clearly visible against the morning sky. He followed the first flare with a second one 2 minutes later, creating an unmistakable pattern that no ship's crew could interpret as anything other than a distress signal. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The cargo ship altered course dramatically, its engines increasing power as it turned toward David's position. Within minutes, he could hear the ship's horn sounding the pattern that indicated acknowledgement of his distress signals. Radio chatter, though incomprehensible at distance, carried across the water with the most beautiful sound David had heard in months: human voices. Engaged in the coordinated effort of maritime rescue, the rescue operation itself unfolded with the professional efficiency that David had hoped for but hadn't dared expect. The cargo ship, which proved to be a Japanese vessel bound for Australia, deployed a rescue boat that reached David's position within 20 minutes of his initial flare. The crew that pulled him from his makeshift raft spoke limited English, but their skill and compassion required no translation. As David was helped aboard the rescue vessel, he experienced a complex mixture of emotions that he hadn't anticipated. Relief at being saved was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by an unexpected sense of loss as he watched his raft disappear in the ship's wake. That crude platform had been his home and transportation for 4 harrowing days, representing everything he had learned about survival, adaptation, and the determination to reach beyond apparent limitations. The ship's medical officer, a soft-spoken man who spoke excellent English despite his Japanese nationality, conducted a thorough examination that revealed David to be in surprisingly good condition, considering his ordeal. Dehydration, exhaustion, and various minor injuries from his ocean crossing required attention, but nothing that threatened his long-term health or recovery. The medical evaluation became David's first real opportunity to process what he had accomplished and survived. During the ship's voyage to its next port, David found himself repeatedly drawn to the deck rail, staring back toward the empty ocean where his island home lay somewhere beyond the horizon. The crew members who had participated in his rescue were eager to hear his story, and David found that talking about his experience helped him begin to understand its significance. The tale that emerged seemed almost incredible even to him. Months of survival on an uncharted island, the discovery of a previous castaway's legacy, and the decision to risk everything on an ocean voyage in a handmade raft. The rescue flare that had secured his salvation became a symbol of the entire journey from helpless castaway to resourceful survivor. David kept the remaining unused flare as a reminder of the moment when human ingenuity and determination had triumphed over isolation and despair. The device represented not just his rescue, but his transformation from someone who had survival skills into someone who had truly learned to survive. The cargo ship carried him towards civilization and reunion with the life he had thought lost forever. David realized that his island experience had changed him in ways that went far beyond mere survival techniques. He had discovered capabilities and strengths that would remain with him regardless of his circumstances, lessons that no amount of comfortable living could erase. 6 months after his rescue, David sat in his Seattle office, surrounded by the familiar trappings of his previous life, but fundamentally changed by his island experience. The transition back to civilization had been more challenging than he had anticipated, not because of physical hardships, but because of the psychological adjustment required to live among abundance after months of profound scarcity. Simple pleasures like hot showers and fresh meals had initially felt overwhelming, while the constant noise and artificial lighting of modern life seemed almost oppressive after the natural rhythms of island existence. His published survival guide had become an unexpected bestseller, though David suspected that readers were more attracted to the adventure narrative than the practical survival information it contained. The book detailed every technique he had learned during his island residency, from basic shelter construction to advanced fishing methods, but it also captured something more elusive, the psychological journey from helpless victim to confident survivor that had been the most significant aspect of his experience. The published survival guide represented more than just documentation of survival techniques. It was David's attempt to honor both his own experience and the legacy of the mysterious J.H., whose knowledge and example had made his survival and escape possible. The book included everything David had learned from J.H.'s artifacts and journal fragments, ensuring that their accumulated wisdom would benefit future wilderness enthusiasts and potential castaways rather than being lost to time and isolation. David had structured the guide as both practical manual and philosophical reflection, recognizing that survival situations required mental and emotional preparation as much as technical knowledge. The chapters covering tool construction and food procurement were balanced by sections addressing the psychological challenges of isolation, the importance of maintaining hope, and the gradual process of adaptation that transformed victims into survivors. The book's success had led to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that David found both rewarding and strange. Audiences seemed hungry for stories of human resilience and self-reliance, perhaps because such qualities felt increasingly rare in a world of technological dependence and institutional support systems. David's story offered proof that individuals could still triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances through determination, ingenuity, and the willingness to learn from both success and failure. But the most significant outcome of publishing, his survival experiences, had been the contact it generated. From other castaways and survival enthusiasts, David received letters from people who had faced their own wilderness challenges, sharing stories of adaptation and resilience that created an unexpected community of individuals who understood the transformative power of survival experiences. Some correspondents had known people who might have been J.H., though none could provide definitive identification of his mysterious predecessor. The search for J.H.'s identity had become a personal mission that extended beyond mere curiosity. David felt a profound obligation to honor someone whose knowledge and example had saved his life, whose careful preparation and generous documentation had made the difference between successful survival and probable death. Through his book and speaking engagements, David hoped to eventually connect with someone who could provide closure to the mystery of J.H.'s fate. David's island experience had also fundamentally altered his relationship with the natural world and his understanding of human capability. Weekend hiking trips that had once seemed challenging now felt almost trivial, while his appreciation for basic resources like fresh water and simple shelter had become permanent aspects of his worldview. He found himself more patient with inconvenience, more grateful for basic comforts, and more confident in his ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The published survival guide served as David's daily reminder of lessons learned through hardship and discovery. Every copy sold carried forward the knowledge that had sustained him during his darkest moments of isolation and doubt. More importantly, it ensured that J.H.'s legacy would continue to serve future generations, transforming the scattered artifacts of one person's island survival into systematic knowledge that could benefit anyone facing similar challenges. As David reviewed the final proofs of the book's second edition, he reflected on the journey that had carried him from desperate castaway to published author and survival expert. The island had taken away his comfortable assumptions about safety and security, but it had given him something more valuable, proof of his own resilience and the deep satisfaction that came from discovering capabilities he had never known he possessed. The published survival guide would outlive both its author and its original inspiration, carrying forward hard-won knowledge about human adaptation and the enduring power of hope in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances.